Hi, I'm Carol Willis, and I'm the founder and director of the Skyscraper Museum, and I'm going to lead this tour today of the South neighborhood of Battery Park City. Battery Park City, as you can see, was landfill when the World Trade Center was just finished. Actually, this photograph is from 1976. And the three neighborhoods that we're going to be looking at, and here we are about here on the sandy plateau of the landfill that was created over the about 10 years or so from the original founding legislation for Battery Park City in 1969, which grew out of an idea that preceded that was advanced by the state of New York. A plan to expand Lower Manhattan as it had been expanded, if I'll walk over here to do the contrast, so many times by landfill over the city's history. So Battery Park itself, which is not Battery Park City, but part of the city of New York. And then the landfill that you see over here, which extends to the ends of the finger piers that themselves expanded the edge of the water even farther out into the Hudson, but that had originally been land that went up, really just past Broadway. So West Street and all of this was still under the water. Until these piers, which operated as the kind of iron corset for Lower Manhattan that serviced all of these ships that were mid-sized ships that encompassed everything from cargo that needed to be broken down from transport, whether it's food or commodities, to ferries that brought people up and down the Hudson into New Jersey. So there was all kinds of maritime uses. And as a consequence of that, the city was cut off from the water, and the water was increasingly noxious and industrial in its use. So the waterfront that you see here in this photograph of 1956, so only 20 years before the one there with the World Trade Center and all the new buildings of Lower Manhattan, this city is really the kind of frozen in time from the 1930s, from the time when the Depression essentially stopped all construction, and an era, since we're at the Skyscraper Museum, an era of tall building design and urban design takes the kind of organic character of the original Manhattan Island, the cut of Wall Street that you see going right through here, centering the financial district, and this kind of pyramid of steel and stone and brick that gives character to the New York skyline that made it so recognizable and that marks the kind of beating heart of capitalism that was Wall Street. So New York always lived by its port and its harbor. The trade that came in along the water's edge was really the lifeblood for this heart. But increasingly through the 19th century and into the 20th century, it was really Wall Street and the financial district that was really driving the development of New York, and downtown and its congested, really kind of tightly concentrated economic development that kind of squeezed up and kind of squeezed in and up in order to create the skyline. Then at the water's edge, there were a few tall buildings that date back to the early 20th century, but most of what you see on either the East River side or the Hudson River side is low rise and less valuable. But this part of the working waterfront of they're called finger piers because they stick out into the water. They, as you can see here in 56, are hardly used at all because this is just the beginning of containerization, really a revolution in the technology of shipping. That meant that those big barges that are piled with the backs of semi-trucks, up high and need a lot of land in order to be offloaded, like in New Jersey. And so that is technology which is much more efficient. It's much less expensive. And so these smaller ships have really become technologically obsolete. So the waterfront is now polluted, unsightly, unused, and dangerous even. So a vision of government in order to create a new use along the waterfront is conceived in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s. So to create a new neighborhood, and that's Battery Park City. A neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, because Lower Manhattan is just a business center, right? So this is to make a kind of complementary uses, to expand the vitality of downtown into live-work spaces. And so Battery Park City is of a scale that's maybe even larger, but of the scale of urban renewal of the 1960s. It's kind of part and parcel of this really big, ambitious thinking about how you reinvent the city in the post-war era. And it's like the tradition of New York in the landfill that invents new land in order to expand the economy. So on this scale of 92 acres ultimately in Battery Park City, you have to be working with the kind of powers and tools of government. So Battery Park City is land that was created by an authority established by the state of New York. So it's not New York City, it's actually land created by New York State through a financial mechanism of bonds and payback of revenues that I'll explain when we're actually out in Battery Park City so that you can see what this financial structure created in terms of an urban environment. But you can see here with the history compared in 1956, a city that's really kind of preserved in amber of the 1930s, and then the generating force of the post-war era with new land, with the world's biggest buildings and the tallest for some time, with a new kind of skyscraper, big and boxy because along Water Street, these are back office spaces for the large corporations that need for the financial service industry that need a lot of clerks and everybody to work centralized but with large floor plates, and with steel and glass towers instead of brick and stone towers that you see in the characteristic form of the 1920s buildings that are shaped by the 1916 zoning law, and here you have a 1961 zoning law that is changing the shape of buildings, and technology is changing the materials that they're built of. So as we look at how New York, how downtown was changing, we can also see its rival up there also growing with the dark buildings that mean that they're this kind of modern building. You can see between those two how Midtown is really taking off as the challenge to Lower Manhattan, where the office space that was formerly, kind of a magnetic center for businesses in Lower Manhattan is migrating up to Park Avenue and 6th Avenue. And that shift then threatens the economy of Lower Manhattan too. And businesses need to stay there and invest there. And here we have One Chase Manhattan Plaza, which is the first in 1956 of the modern office buildings. So downtown is fighting back to become a more viable neighborhood with more amenities and with access to the waterfront that it hadn't had before. So we had a park in Battery Park City, and now we have the continuous esplanade along the river that develops out of this government plan to create housing and public space for Battery Park City. Does anybody have any questions about that before we do go outside and begin to walk around?
Who were the political leaders who were most enthusiastic?
So no coincidence that Nelson Rockefeller joined in a public-private partnership, which is characteristic of planning in these days, with his brother David Rockefeller, who is the head of Chase Manhattan Bank and the head of the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association. So the kind of business interests that that banded together in order to think in planning terms from the private enterprise side to balance out the government initiatives.
So Battery Park itself is also on landfill?
Battery Park is entirely landfill. Well, they took the piers away. They demolished the piers, and I'll show you in some photographs that as we walk around with my little notebook, so that you can see the cofferdams that were created as an edge at the pier heads, so on the water side of the pier, and everything back from there is filled in. We're actually going to walk on that area, so we can talk about it as we walk around. Anybody else? Okay, let's go out. Let me tell you a little bit about the Skyscraper Museum, since we're now standing out front of our building, because it really does relate to the financial structure that established Battery Park City. The Battery Park City Authority then is an entity that was created by New York State in order to master plan the area of the landfill, turn it into a plan for a residential community that had to also have already installed all the infrastructure of the roads and the plumbing, the sewers and everything. So they had to oversee that part of the execution of the master plan. At their foundational premise was the idea that park of Battery Park City was a key 1/3 of those three names, because about 1/3 of the space of Battery Park City is devoted to public parks. And the parks are paid for by the residential investments that were still to come. They were still in the future as they were making this master plan. So the idea was that the apartment houses and the commercial center would create revenue on land that was leased to them, so that they pay ground rents to the Battery Park City Authority, and the residents of the apartment buildings pay rent to the developers, who then pay their payment in lieu of taxes to Battery Park City Authority. And a revenue stream is created over time when the buildings are there, to pay back the bonds that were sold to the public to raise, started $300 million, and then it kept going to build all the infrastructure and to build the parks, right? So the promise of the future revenues, what today guys financial structure people call TIFs, the tax increment financing. It's all the bonds are raised, and the state of New York can issue bonds. So in conjunction with financial institutions. So this blank slate that I'm going to show you of Battery Park City, a master plan that was created in this area in 1976. Is all future buildings, but just blocks on sand. And we're going to see how long that sand persisted before there was any kind of revenue stream that was going to begin to pay back those bonds. So the public had to believe that this was going to, that their bonds would pay them the money back, that they wouldn't default. So with some government assurance, the plan was advanced with the government like Nelson Rockefeller and the financial institutions like David Rockefeller. There was a kind of partnership and consensus that played out here to eventual success, because it took until the 1980s for the first housing to be built. So from 1969, essentially, over a decade. And then the most recent of the final towers to occupy the sites, because every block is now built out, is after about 2015, 2016. So it took several decades for this to become an assured assured payback of the original plan. So how does this relate to the Skyscraper Museum? Because the Battery Park City Authority established under their aegis this master plan, and then they negotiate with developers to develop all of the different sites, they were able to leverage some public space in every project of every new development. And so developers competed for the opportunity to develop the site. The one that built this tower, which is a combination of a hotel at the base, unfortunately now gone after COVID. It was first a Ritz-Carlton, and then more recently a Wagner small hotels, and it closed from COVID. So their real estate cycles and various other economic cycles play a big role in urban development, and we're going to wait and see how this one plays out. But there's a condominium tower above, so residences. And the Skyscraper Museum is a public amenity in this space, so we have free rent. Our developer won the right to develop the site. Part of the thing that they promised in their contract was to provide a public amenity space, and so as a not-for-profit, we're that space. So we enjoy. It's not free by any means, but at least there's no rent, and we didn't have to purchase the space. Yeah.
So the buildings, whether they're commercial buildings or residential buildings?
A little bit louder. Commercial
the
buildings.
buildings, whether they're commercial buildings or residential buildings, are all on a land lease?
Yeah, all the ground is owned by the Battery Park City Authority, and they're leased for development. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, other quick questions?
So this was happening at a dark time in New York City's history.
Well,
and yet it kept moving
the
forward.
70s were a dark time in terms of the fiscal crisis, for sure, because when the World Trade Center was finished, it was mostly empty for a long time, right? And you'll see, I will show you now, photographs of the landfill that took 10 years essentially to get filled in and then to settle enough that it could sustain construction. And here you see now with the World Trade Center finished, and what this is just a beach. It would not be the right word. It's all sand, but it's essentially detritus and fill. They did eventually do kind of art on the beach, and they put white sand on top of it in order to have a final layer, and then it was utilized for public art projects called like Art on the Beach. But it's pretty desolate, and it uninviting to any public that would be coming this direction. And in some cases, you could actually get there. I'm going to talk more about some of the projects to make Battery Park City, to raise its awareness in the kind of the New York population. Okay, so but let's walk across the street carefully. We are now in part of the park space of Battery Park City, and again throughout the whole waterfront and inland as well. A third of the space is devoted to parks, and the people who live here and pay their rents pay an increment for an additional increment beyond their rent to support the parks. So the public-private partnership exists in order to create the public realm space within Battery Park City. And we're going to be walking towards that little pavilion if they let us go through there. You know, this is the Midsummer Festival. They always do. Yesterday was the first day of summer, and the Swedes are always celebrating out here about this time of the year. So maybe we'll cut a little bit around, and we'll go through the landscape parks, the kind of formal gardens, out onto a lawn that you can see here from the original designs, because we'll walk over here to Pier A, which is the oldest remaining finger pier in the city, and you can see the kind of geometry here in the little pavilion that we'll walk through, which isn't going to be here much longer. And as we proceed around, I'll point to these little signages that have been posted in the ground, because we're standing now in an area that is going to be the resiliency project, or the counter rising waters project of the climate change threat that Battery Park City suffers under, and we all suffer under it across New York. Back at Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy, the water came up over Battery Park. It actually didn't come into Battery Park City. It went up West Street, and it came like back around the side of our building, flooded into the basements, blew out all the transformers within that. But we didn't get water on this side, and we got wetting. There was a little bit of water that came within 8 feet of the front door of the Skyscraper Museum, and that is only the first herald of what is sure to be other similar surges, tidal surges. So in order to counteract that, Battery Park City Authority has undertaken to work with the City of New York to be one of the first pieces in this kind of long necklace of resiliency projects that will go around, especially the southern point of the island, but need to protect all the way up into 23rd Street and West Chelsea, for example, are all parts that have been flooded during Sandy. So there's one of the signs right there. This area right here is going to be elevated 12 feet. And the park that you see here, beginning in like August or September, will be full of cranes and earth-moving machines. And when it's all over, a new design, but something very much with the same kind of flavor of landscape architecture, will be 12 feet in the air instead, with a series of ramps that gently rise. And within that is a seawall that is supposed to counter what is the predicted surge for through the end of this century or so. So there's little choice. We've already seen the future a decade ago, and something has to be done. And because the Battery Park City Authority is relatively rich compared to other neighborhoods of New York, they've undertaken to do the first step. They've been involved in a public engagement process that has yielded the architectural designs that you can see around here, and we're going to pass by several others. So take a picture now, because after September it's not going to look like this anymore. Let's go here. The festival here has ruined the axis that you're supposed to see when you stand on that disc right there and look through the center of this arch, now seen here from the other side, straight on line to the Statue of Liberty, right? So the connection between Lady Liberty and Battery Park City is a kind of obsessive relationship, I think, in the architecture, especially. We'll see other examples of that. But I want you to be able to see in this photograph. You're looking against the sun, so why don't I put it this way and you can see it. So from the water side, which we'll go out to in a minute, you can see these arches. A very 1996 design by the architects Machado and Silvetti, two professors at Harvard, who were very attached to postmodernism and the kind of poeticism of incorporating history and symbolism through a kind of speaking architecture. So what you're seeing here looks a little bit like bare Roman ruins that are somehow embedded into the earth, but it also, as you can see, bears a relationship to this kind of face that, I don't know if you see the Statue of Liberty's eyes there, right? So those are their drawings that are it's as if the mirror image, the sister of the Statue of Liberty, is somehow, kind of sunk into the base of this park. So this pavilion too is going to be erased by the plans to expand, to create a seawall and to expand the structure so it becomes a barrier between the harbor and here. And we'll see some designs of the arches that have been created. It's quite different in its character. And so take a look at this one too, because it won't be here for more than about 2 more months. It's a lovely work of kind of architectural monumentality, but yet at a scale that looks, compared to the skyscrapers of the skyline of Lower Manhattan, and in general the kind of advancing scale of buildings, almost miniaturized compared to the kind of titanic and monumental. well, all the way up to like 23rd Street.
23rd Street?
Yeah, eventually. We'll see how long it takes. Yeah. We're going to walk over to Pier A. So we're standing here before Pier A, which is the oldest pier in the city of New York, and it's a survivor because it belongs to the city. And indeed, this little section here, the little inlet between Pier A in New York City and what was Pier 1 of, I think I showed it to you. Here it is here. So here's Pier A in a historic photograph, and here's Pier 1. So we're switching from alphabet to numbers, right? So all of the Port of New York's piers are numbered, but they began their life as private development, because from the very foundation of New York, as first New Amsterdam and then New York in the 18th century, waterfront lots was the way that the city developed its waterfront, the infrastructure of its waterfront. So whether it was piers or roads, when you got water lots, you bought the right to build a pier. So New York's public-private partnerships began at the very beginning. Well, they began with the Dutch, really, because the Dutch established, the East India Trading Company as a commercial enterprise. But the expansion of New York's shoreline by landfill was created by, not by the city, but by private enterprise, by individuals who bought the right to develop a section of the land as either landfill or as a pier. And then when they built the pier, they were also obliged to build a city road in order to get to it on their section. So it was a kind of incremental development, but because the growth was so exuberant, so continuous through trade, through immigration, the city expanded, and these were very valuable. They then became, with the creation not just of docks and barges and boat trade, with railroads. The railroads began to control a lot of the piers because their railroad cars would come on barges, lighterage from the continent to Manhattan Island, right? So, and that was all privately developed until about the 1890s, when the city began to regulate it, right? And from Pier A, where the Department of Docks oversaw the activity of the harbor, and what later became the fire department's pier for the kind of marine, firefighting vessels, and then fell obsolete from about the 1950s and 60s, and has only come back, and only partially come back, I guess, even now, under a series of projects by the Economic Development Corporation that failed to find private enterprises like restaurants that would occupy them, and eventually, and just before COVID, the Battery Park City Authority took over Pier A in order to try to develop it. I don't know if you can barely see underneath, but one thing that really distinguishes Pier A is it's on granite columns. It's on a foundation like a building would be on a foundation, rather than on finger piers, which of course are just wood tree trunks that are creosoted and then driven into the sand and silt. So it has been restored, so it looks like it did originally in 1884 when it was constructed. And it's got a kind of tin surface on a combination of some wood joists and metal joists. So it's an historic structure of some 140, almost 150 years at this point.
During the renovation of the Wagner Park, or
I heard something about innovation, but what?
Is it going to stay as is,
Yeah,
the level, or also raised?
Oh,
12 feet?
I think I don't think there's a plan to raise it, and it's been, I'm sure, flooded many times over the years. So you build piers to be able to do that. So knock wood. So we're going to follow along the Esplanade now to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And remember, as we pass along here, that all of this super expensive seawall and the lovely pavement that we can walk on and all the gardens that are on our east were all created by the money of the bonds for the Battery Park City Authority, and they became the inducement, the lure for the future neighborhood of the apartment buildings that developers then constructed. And it's much more populated, so it used to be that students, we brought the students around here and they were very alienated by how homogenous it was and, upper income. Yeah. And now it's if not very diverse as New York is, more so. And Battery Park City is a very family-oriented place to live, and you can see the population that's here today is here because of I think probably a lot of them because of the festival and because it's a nice summer day, and the parks of Battery Park City down really do create a real incentive to come down with your family. But in the winter time, when it's really more of the locals, you can see a lot of parents with strollers. It's more of a kind of suburban lifestyle or analogous to that. So people might consider a house in New Jersey or a condo in Battery Park City, and the demographic is quite high in terms of income. It's something probably $170,000, something like that, HMI. So it's an affluent place. It does have some affordable housing. There are 300 units of effectively subsidized housing that are part of a lottery system and an eligibility system. But in general, it's not particularly. It's far less diverse than the city of New York, but it is typical of Lower Manhattan in terms of its demography. And I'll put in a plug for our new exhibition, which, if you walk through the museum, doesn't have any of its labels yet, but it has some key demographic information on one of the walls, because it's called Residential Rising Lower Manhattan since 9/11. So it looks at downtown's development and new architecture, but also conversion of office buildings to residential, because the downtown population has doubled from about 40,000 people to 82,000 people in the last 20 years, which is a much higher rate than the rest of the city. And Battery Park City has some 13,000 people of that population. So it's it is clearly a success in terms of its original agenda to create a neighborhood and to create parks. It's built out now, and there's close to 14,000 people who live here, and many more that visit, especially on the weekends and on beautiful summer days. So part of the agenda, besides the parks, are the cultural institutions of Battery Park City. And one of the ones that was very early down here is this first part of the construction of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And this is a kind of amusing or illuminating article about Battery Park City's was in 1994. It's rather new success, because here is the commercial center of the World Financial Center. You can see the north neighborhood has Stuyvesant High School and not very much else. It has a few kind of starter buildings of rental properties. These are the buildings that we're going to end up with on this tour in a few moments. Around Rector Place, and you can see the scale of these is really quite small, more like the Machado Silvetti Pavilion, certainly than the commercial skyscrapers, but then in all of the towers that follow after along West Street, where the condos kind of renegotiate Battery Park City with the city of New York how many units they can add to the space, because they need to add more units to generate more revenue in order to build the rest of Battery Park City. So there's a kind of heightening scale that happens over the decades of Battery Park City's development. But even in 1994, which is only the beginning of New York scratching its way back out of the stock market crash of 1887 and the real estate recession that goes through the mid-1990s. So you can see there's not very much development down here yet. This is the site of the future Skyscraper Museum right there. But yet the Esplanade is pretty continuous, or is continuous, and the gardens have all been filled in. So you can see that only, 25 years ago, far less than half of Battery Park City was filled out. But here is the little octagonal structure of the original Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And the building that we walked to when just across the street is this bar building that you see right there. It's a big rectangle. And I just wanted you to see above the blue tarpaulin, there is a beautiful public art sculpture that you can access for free through the museum, and it's created by Andy Goldsworthy, the sculptor you may know from a kind of nature art perspective. And here you can see, now there's so many leaves here, maybe you can see around the corner that there are trees up on this little terrace. And what he created here, it has a beautiful kind of memory garden that about changes over time, and this is the living memorial to the Holocaust museum. It's a series of boulders on a kind of rock carpet that are chiseled in at the center, and then he planted a tree in that, that crevice. And the trees now have grown up. The little sapling has grown into a tree, and over time the roots of the tree extend into the cracks of the boulder and force them apart. So the idea is that this is a sculpture that changes over time, and that nature kind of triumphs over stone. It's a beautiful piece, and it's typical of the art projects that have been introduced into the public space, as well as gardens. So we're going to walk to the front of the museum and then to the South Cove, to the staircase artwork by Mary Miss, and past some other sculptures that we've seen along the way. And this really impressive public art project that was part of the early history when the deserted sand beach was all there was with no construction on it. And if you can see in this overlay the color inset on the whole of a Google map, right? This is showing you the about 4 acres or so. That was this called the Wheat Fields project that looked like this by the artist Agnes Dennis. Some of you might have seen this, the one person show that she had at the Shed about 2 years ago, a really brilliant show, large-scale landscape art in particular. And what you can see here in this perfect golden rectangle is a wheat field that she grew by tilling the land, marshaling a small army of starving artists to come out and help her to dump enough fertilizer in order to make the wheat grow, and to take a tractor and to cultivate this land in more photographs to show you, I think, we'll show you Agnes tending her wheat here in this great photograph. Some with the World Trade Center here in the background with the harvester, and they did get something like 80 bushels of wheat out of the site. And the point of her avant-garde project was to show this wheat field in contrast to the kind of steel monuments of kind of the tombstones of the skyscrapers of the World Trade Center and of Lower Manhattan. So she donated the grain to, I think, the UN or UNESCO, and those that project was photographed by her as part of the project, and I think it's one of the most moving and visually stunning of any of the public art projects in New York's history, not just to say Art on the Beach, which had a series of performances and installations over the years through the 1970s, 80s, and even into the 90s. So that was a way to try to get people to pay attention to Battery Park City, to actually come down here. And that was a struggle over the years. I think that's other than to see the sustainability plans, which you can look at later. From here, as we look across to Jersey City, and you see the activity of the ferries and what pleasure craft, I guess, on the Hudson River, you get an idea from the very different landscaping here than we saw in the gardens of the kind of natural riverfront vegetation that is meant here to evoke the origins of Manhattan Island before the piers of the area that we're standing on. So there are boulders, there are natural kind of indigenous plants, and for those who came late and said this is supposed to look like a natural shoreline. This structure, which kind of looks like a grand staircase, but if you see the kind of crown shape at the top, a kind of canopy, that is the same dimension, and it's meant to evoke the crown of the Statue of Liberty. So, here's another reference, which is kind of obsessive down here, to the connection to the harbor and the Statue of Liberty. It's designed by the sculptor Mary Miss, and the whole of this area called South Cove, which is created to look as if it's a natural cove, but it was created purpose-built, is by Stan Eckstut, who is one of the planners who worked with Alexander Cooper. So Cooper Eckstut, who designed that master plan for Battery Park City that I showed you before. And as we walk along here past these lower scale apartment buildings that were part of the original master plan, both in its the blocks as they were laid out, in the massing, as architects would say, of the structures in terms of their height and the configuration of the buildings. These were all established by the master plan, as were the materials that were set throughout Battery Park City. So especially red brick and beige brick, a kind of traditional palette of construction for maybe 19th century New York, whether it's brownstone city or brick row houses. That is the kind of uniform palette of materials for Battery Park City. It's also typical of the era in which this plan is being created, where the influence of postmodernism and the influence of history, as opposed to kind of urban renewal, modern, socialist modernism, utilitarian international style values. So this is a kind of return to history, and indeed the master plan, we're going to see it especially in Rector Place, that is created with the idea of a kind of collage of neighborhoods of New York. So a little bit of Gramercy Park, a little bit of West End Avenue, the kind of quotations of New York neighborhoods is supposed to give a familiar scale, so that if you want to rent an apartment, here's a place where you're gonna feel comfortable. You think of West End Avenue and the kind of beige brick and terracotta stone. This is the kind of sensibility that they're going to make a kind of instant architecture out of on new land and new neighborhoods. All right, so we've got about 3 blocks to go, and because I've been talking too long back there, I think we'll take the short tour instead of going the Esplanade way. As we pass by these little dead-end streets that you can see just in the kind of next block over, the 2 towers, that's the heightened scale of the condominiums that were part of the revised master plan, so that more units were added, more stories were added. And the scale really changes in the 2000s. So here you can see down South End Avenue how we're approaching the commercial core, which are the 4 buildings of the originally World Financial Center, now Brookfield Place. Behind that, One World Trade Center, the major replacement for the World Trade Center. which is across West Street and in the city of New York. And as you can see as we walk along here, the scale of these buildings is, as I was saying, not nearly as great as what you're seeing on the West Street edge of Battery Park. And now you see across the street, 50 West Street, that kind of gleaming stainless steel and extended glass curtain wall. That's one of the buildings in our new exhibition, one of the towers that came after 9/11. And the one that you see there in the background is in Battery Park City, and that's the Visionaire by the architects Pelly Clark. That was originally Pelly Clark Pelly, Caesar Pelly, and his son Raphael Pelly, and their partner Fred Clark. And that's a condominium that was built in about 2014. So as we're passing along here, you see we're walking on the sidewalk park, but we could be protected if it were raining, or we were seeking shade in this arcade, which was prescribed by the master plan and the original Cooper Eckstut Plan to create a kind of sheltered space, kind of like an Italian, Urbino or Bologna, which was very much what they were thinking of at the time. The function of it, though, never really worked very well because the shops that were originally intended as commercial space have no presence on the street, and so they have not been all that successful, which may have been in part a function of how slowly Battery Park City populated, because you need a critical mass of people in order to support little shops or a dry cleaner and all the amenities of urban life. And it took a while. It was a little bit of a back and forth in terms of the cyclicity of the real estate cycle and the populating of Battery Park City. Now I just want to conclude by talking about the structures that frame this little square, which is called Rector Place. 2 blocks, and so about probably twice as big as Gramercy Park over on the east side in the teens, is the specific paradigm for this development. And the architecture that you see around follows the same rules that I was talking about, a palette of materials, but different lots got different developers to develop them, and those developers hired different architects, and that was also part of the plan, that there be some variety. This is in contrast to what you would see on the second of our tours with World Financial Center, Brookfield Place, and also Gateway Plaza, which is the very first initiative of residential development back by LaFrac back in the like 1979 and through, I think they finished in 83. And they are bare concrete, each unit like the other, very utilitarian, and all turned inward around a central kind of taxi drop-off or car drop-off, not walking streets and shady pathways. So an utterly different mindset of urban development. And this one is all entirely by design, but it's a kind of calculated variation within the overall harmony that the master plan guidelines established. So that in this building, by quite well-known now deceased architect Charles Moore, who was one of the leaders of the postmodernist movement. He did a lot of things, but he engaged in postmodernism for a good part of his career. And there you can see the return of ornament to facades, right? You see the kind of terracotta, kind of almost arch, but more like drapery. You see cornice lines, which kind of take you back to West End Avenue and the kind of classical architecture of the 1910s and 20s. But there's also a variety with both the massing of a tower block, so those apartments get beautiful views up and across the river and of the setting sun across the water. That's by Jim Polshek. And the others that are probably look more standard to the eye rather than a kind of name brand firm. Actually, Robert A.M. Stern were the lower rise buildings that we walked across by South Cove. So there's a whole range of architects practicing, some kind of well-known in the architectural academic community and others kind of standard practitioners. But what makes this place is its scale, the vegetation, the plantings, the quiet, except for the helicopters, and a sense of a place apart from the city of New York, and that's at once the attraction of Battery Park City for a lot of people, but it was also its shortcoming for many, many years when people who really like the convenience, the energy, the commotion, the density of New York, like I do, feel more comfortable in an urban environment where you just walk outside and there's a shop where you can, your deli where you can pick up your bagel and everything. So this has a more kind of suburban quality to it, but it's a kind of public realm paradigm that there were few opportunities to win back in New York. Everybody's got Central Park, but nobody had the waterfront back in the 1960s. And so this opens up the waterfront to development through the investment, through the organization of the government, but through the investment of private enterprise, establishing a model of public-private partnership that academics today like to denounce as neoliberalism, but nevertheless, public-private partnerships are something that, when executed well with a certain amount of authority and with enough time to develop, from the 1960s to the setback of 9/11 to about 2015 or so, till Battery Park City is built out. The parks came first, and the residences came afterwards, or the residential buildings came afterwards, and in some cases the residents themselves came even after that. So you need a structure that believes this can happen. You need a long timeline for it to develop, and you need some front-end investment by government in order to create a public realm. And to me, that is the success of Battery Park City ultimately.